King Robert Baratheon's laughter echoed through the great hall of Winterfell like a storm breaking after a long winter. The air smelled of roasted meats, spiced wine, and burning torches. Ned Stark sat beside his oldest friend, wearing a face carved from ice. Duty weighed heavy on his broad shoulders, even while others feasted. Robert slapped him on the back, nearly spilling Ned's wine. "You've grown stiff, Ned. Too much time in the cold north makes a man forget joy." Ned offered a tight smile. "Joy is harder to find when you carry a kingdom on your back." Robert chuckled again, but his eyes softened. "That's why I need you in King's Landing. I need someone I can trust." Those words, innocent to most, felt like a shackle around Ned's neck. He remembered what happened the last time he followed Robert blindly, the rebellion, the blood, and Lyanna's bed soaked in red. Honor had always been his compass. But he wondered now, as Robert asked him to become Hand of the King, if honor alone could guide a man through the thorns of the capital. Catelyn's eyes found his across the hall. She looked calm, but he knew that behind her measured gaze, questions burned. They had spoken about this in private, with quiet voices after the children slept. She did not trust the Lannisters. Neither did he. But still, when the raven arrived with the message from Jon Arryn's widow, "They killed him," Ned felt the old ghost stir. Jon was like a father to him. If he had been murdered, there had to be a reason. And if the Lannisters were behind it, Robert's life was in danger. Still, even with all this, Ned hesitated. Because to go south meant stepping into a different kind of war. Not with swords, but with lies, whispers, and betrayals. And he had never been a man for such things. On the morning they departed, Winterfell felt colder than usual. The wind carried a warning. Bran had fallen, no, been pushed, from the tower. They didn't say it out loud, but he knew it in his bones. Something dark had come to his house with the royal family. And yet, he left. As their party rode south, Ned kept his silence most days. He watched Arya ride wildly through the trees, while Sansa stayed close to Queen Cersei, eager to impress. The closer they got to King's Landing, the more distant his children felt from him. Then there was the moment with the dire wolf, Lady. Sansa's wolf was executed not for her crime, but Arya's. And Robert had let it happen. That day, Ned saw how little control the king truly had. He saw how much sway the queen held over him. He buried the wolf himself, hands dirty, soul heavy. He wondered, was this the price of refusing to play the game? In King's Landing, Ned found a city dressed in gold but rotting underneath. Whispers filled the Red Keep. Spiders spun webs in council chambers. Littlefinger smiled too much. Varys said too little. And Renly, well, Renly played both sides as if the war had already begun. Jon Arryn's death had not been natural. That much was clear. Ned started pulling at threads, quietly, cautiously. He asked questions. Too many questions. And like a man walking into a snare, he didn't see how fast the walls were closing. Cersei was beautiful, sharp-tongued, and more dangerous than anyone Ned had known. When he confronted her about her children's parentage, about Jaime, about the incest, he gave her a chance. He told her, like a man of honor, to flee with her children. But that was Ned's mistake. Because in the South, mercy was weakness. Honor was foolishness. Truth was a weapon wielded by the reckless. And Ned Stark was still the same man who believed in doing what was right, not what was necessary. He thought Robert would listen. But Robert died on a boar hunt, too conveniently, and Cersei moved faster than any of them. By the time Ned tried to act, it was already too late. The game had been played without him, and he was the last to know. As he stood in the cold dungeons beneath the Red Keep, his hands chained, he finally understood. The South was not a place for men like him. They didn't fear swords, they feared secrets. And he had uncovered too many. But even now, staring at the stone walls, waiting for judgment. Ned did not regret being who he was. He regretted only that his children would pay for his choices. He had refused to play the game. And in this world, that was the same as losing. The cell stank of rot and damp stone. Ned Stark sat with his back against the cold wall, his hands shackled, the iron biting into his wrists. He had fought in battles, ridden through snows that could break a man's bones, and faced rebels with nothing but steel and duty. But none of that prepared him for this: silence, betrayal, and the suffocating weight of failure. He had trusted the wrong people. He had trusted in honor, in truth, in doing the right thing. And in King's Landing, none of that mattered. Varys visited him sometimes. The spider, soft-footed and soft-spoken, came not with keys or weapons, but with words. "You were not wrong, Lord Stark," he had whispered in one of those visits. "Only too slow. Too honest. Too proud." Ned didn't answer. He didn't trust Varys, not truly. But the eunuch brought food and water, and sometimes, news of his daughters. That was all Ned cared about now. Sansa was still in the Red Keep. Betrothed to Joffrey, the boy king. The false heir. The product of incest and lies. And Arya. Arya had vanished. Some said she'd run. Some said she was caught and killed. No one gave Ned a straight answer. He thought of his daughters constantly, each in her own way. Sansa with her dreams of romance and golden courts, utterly blind to the poison around her. Arya with her fire, her wildness, her refusal to fit the mold. He prayed she had escaped. That somewhere out in the filth of the capital, she had found someone kind. Someone who knew the truth. One night, Varys returned with something different in his tone. "They want your confession." Ned looked up. His voice cracked from disuse. "A lie?" "Yes," Varys nodded. "A lie. But one that could save your daughter's life. Perhaps both their lives. If you admit to treason. If you bend." Ned laughed bitterly. It wasn't a joyful laugh, it was dry, painful. Bend the knee to a boy who stole a throne he has no right to. Varys didn't blink. "Yes. If it means living. If it means protecting your blood. Think, Lord Stark. The truth has brought you here, to this cell. But a lie might let you walk again. It might spare your daughter a blade." That was the cruel part of the South, Ned realized. Truth had no power here unless it was dressed in gold or carried by someone ruthless. Lies ruled this place. And now they wanted him to join in it. To kneel, to smile, to admit to crimes he never committed. And yet, he thought of Sansa. Of Arya. Of Robb in the north, too young to lead but already preparing for war. Of little Bran, broken from the fall. Of Rickon, who wouldn't understand why his father never came home. If Ned died, they would suffer. He closed his eyes. The next morning, he was dragged from his cell, weak from hunger and darkness, and brought to the steps of the great September of Baelor. The sun hit his eyes like a sword. Before him stood a crowd of thousands, nobles, peasants, merchants, and beggars, all waiting to see if the noble Lord Stark would beg for his life. Joffrey sat on the throne, smug and twisted. Cersei by his side, her face unreadable. Sansa stood nearby, pale and shaking. The High Septon called out the charges. Treason. Conspiracy. Attempting to usurp the throne from King Joffrey Baratheon. Ned looked at the crowd. At his daughter. At the boy king who should never have been crowned. Then he spoke. "I am Eddard Stark of Winterfell," he began. "And I come before you not as a lord or a warrior, but as a father." The crowd hushed. "I was wrong," he said, the words tasting like poison. Wrong to question the legitimacy of his grace, King Joffrey. Wrong to plot against the throne. I accept the mercy of the crown and confess my crimes. Gasps rippled through the audience. Cersei gave the slightest nod. Varys looked relieved. Even Sansa let out a soft cry of hope. But Joffrey's eyes gleamed. He stood up. My mother wants him to live, the boy said, voice high and cruel. My council wants him to live. But they are all wrong. The crowd tensed. Treason must never go unpunished, Joffrey shouted. Bring me his head. For a moment, time stopped. Cersei's face turned white. Varys took a step forward but said nothing. Sansa screamed. And Ned just closed his eyes. He had lied to save his daughters. He had betrayed everything he stood for, hoping to protect them. But in the end, the game was never meant for men like him. Morning mist clung low to the earth, wrapping the northern camp in a blanket of grey silence. What few men remained loyal to Robb Stark walked quietly, heads down, avoiding one another's gaze. The air held a strange heaviness, not from defeat, but from doubt. It crept like mold through the tents, infecting every corner of their cause. Robb stood outside his command tent, eyes fixed on the distant horizon. The Karstarks had left in the night. Over 300 swords gone, banners rolled and loyalty withdrawn. His war host was bleeding, not from battle, but from within. The wind carried with it a whisper of things cracking apart. He knew the cost of Lord Karstark's execution. He had ordered it himself, after a brief trial, in front of every major house in the camp. There was no joy in it, only necessity. Rickard had taken justice into his own hands. Robb had to show the realm that no one, not even a lord of the north, was above the king's justice. But now, those same lords eyed him with quiet resentment. They didn't say it aloud, but it showed, in the way they spoke less, drank more, and planned behind closed tent flaps. Even Talisa had grown distant. That night, she sat across from him, her face dimly lit by the fire between them. Her eyes no longer held softness, only concern, sharpened like a blade. You're bleeding, Robb, she said quietly. He frowned. I'm not wounded. You are. Just not where it shows. He said nothing. What could he say? That he was surrounded by ghosts. That every decision he made seemed to cost him another piece of himself. She leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. If you lose the North's trust, you lose everything. No war. No kingdom. No future. Robb clenched his jaw. Then what would you have me do? Send Jaime back to Cersei with a bow and a kiss? What would that make me, Talisa? A king? Or a beggar? Talisa flinched, not at his words, but at the anger behind them. I'd rather be a beggar with sisters than a king with regrets. The words hung heavy between them. And for the first time, Robb looked away. In King's Landing, another storm brewed. Word of Robb's refusal had reached the Lannisters, and Cersei's rage was fire enough to burn the Red Keep to the ground. She had counted on the trade. She had prepared for it. Sansa had even been dressed like a queen-in-waiting the day the Raven arrived. But no exchange came. Instead, Jaime remained in chains, and Cersei's fury turned inward. Send a message, she ordered to her council, voice cold as a dagger. One they'll understand. 2 days later, a raven left the capital. No scroll. No writing. Just a package. When it arrived at Robb's camp, the maester unwrapped it carefully, hands trembling. Inside was a lock of red-brown hair, tangled and bloodied. Arya's hair. Or so they thought. Robb stared at it for a long time. It might have been hers. The color was right. The length. But Arya was gone, lost, rumored dead, or hidden among the chaos. It could have been a trick. Or it could have been a message. Next time, it won't just be hair, the implied warning rang in his ears. He didn't show the others. Not even to Lisa. He tucked it away in a leather pouch, close to his chest. But the weight of it, it was unbearable. And still, he didn't trade Jaime. Maybe it was pride now. Or maybe something worse, fear of being seen as weak. The boy who let a golden lion walk free while the north bled. But as night fell again, Robb sat alone by the fire, grey wind at his side, and whispered, "Tell me I'm not wrong." The wolf raised its head, ears flicking, but gave no answer. No one did any more. And far away, in a brothel in Flea Bottom, Arya Stark, dirty, disguised, and still breathing, coughed through the smoke of the fire she had just set. She was very much alive. But no raven would carry that truth to Robb Stark any time soon. The banners of the north had risen. Swords were sharpened, armor strapped, and oaths sworn under the eyes of old gods and new. At the head of it all rode Robb Stark, his father's face carved into his heart like stone. They called him, the young wolf, but Robb wasn't chasing glory, he was chasing justice. Or maybe vengeance. In the south, they couldn't tell the difference. But in the north, they didn't care. Robb's army moved fast. Too fast for the Lannisters to understand at first. Tywin Lannister had the numbers, the gold, and the ruthlessness. But Robb had something else. Purpose. A reason to fight. A father wrongly executed, sisters taken hostage, and a house whose honor had been spat on in front of the whole realm. Catelyn rode with him, quiet but sharp. Every word she spoke was measured, but every night she wept alone. She had begged Robb not to lose himself in anger. She feared watching one son die trying to avenge another. But Robb didn't listen. Or couldn't. He had been forced to grow too fast, and now he was carrying a kingdom's worth of rage in his chest. When they captured Jaime Lannister, it was a victory the South hadn't expected. The Kingslayer, the lion himself, brought low by the wolf cub. But Robb didn't gloat. He didn't celebrate. He locked Jaime in a cell and refused to let emotion guide him. That was one thing he had learned from his father, never lose control. But unlike Ned Stark, Robb had also learned something else, something darker. If you don't play the game, you lose. And if you play it too honestly, you die. So Robb played, in his own way. He made alliances. He promised Walder Frey his hand in marriage for safe passage across the Twins. He moved his army like a blade through the Riverlands. And for a time, it worked. But war has a way of stealing from you, even when you're winning. Back in King's Landing, Sansa had become a living symbol of northern submission. Every court day she was forced to smile beside the boy who murdered her father. Joffrey's cruelty wasn't just private now, it was performance. He humiliated her in front of the court. He struck her when she spoke too freely. He called her little dove, like she was something fragile meant to be broken. And all the while, she kept pretending. She told them what they wanted to hear. She thanked Joffrey for his mercy. She played the role of the obedient lady. But inside her, something else was growing. A coldness. A silence filled with knives. Every day, she remembered her father's execution. Every night, she swore she would never love again, never trust again, and never forget. Arya, meanwhile, had seen more death than most knights. Traveling under the name Fairy, she had become one of the lost, dirty, nameless, forgotten. But she had learned how to fight. How to lie. How to survive. Every time she added a name to her list, she whispered it like a prayer. And in her mind, she kept seeing her father's face, calm, resigned, broken by betrayal. She hadn't just lost a father. She had lost her world. And now she wanted to tear down the ones who built it. Far beyond the wall, Jon Snow faced his own war. He had returned to his brothers at Castle Black, but the world had changed for him. Honor, duty, loyalty, they still meant something. But now he saw what they could cost. When he looked into the fire at night, he saw Ned Stark's head fall again and again. His father had raised him to be better. But better didn't survive. Sam once asked him, "Do you think Lord Stark would have lied, if he knew what would happen?" Jon hadn't answered then. But he thought about it constantly. Maybe Ned Stark died not because he was weak, but because the world was too rotten for men like him. Maybe he didn't refuse to play the game because he was naive, but because he didn't want to become like the rest. That was the irony, Jon realized. His father had died for his honor, but the lie had been the last thing he ever spoke. And still, it hadn't saved him. The truth hadn't saved anyone. As winter deepened and snow began to fall even in the Riverlands, rumors of dragons across the sea spread quietly among sailors and merchants. Whispers of a Targaryen girl with fire in her blood and no mercy in her heart. The world was shifting. The board was resetting. And though Ned Stark was long gone, the storm he left behind was only beginning. Snow had started to fall even in the Riverlands, soft and thin like ash drifting from a distant fire. It wasn't heavy enough to stop armies, but it was enough to remind everyone what was coming. Winter wasn't just a word Northerners used, it was a promise. A warning. And now, it had begun to whisper across Westeros. Robb Stark sat alone in his tent, eyes fixed on the flickering candlelight. The map in front of him was stained with ink, blood, and regret. He'd won every battle, but the war wasn't a matter of swords and strategy anymore. It was about trust, betrayal, timing, and luck. The kind of things you couldn't control. The kind of things his father never tried to manipulate. And maybe that's why his father died. Robb sometimes caught himself wondering, what would Lord Eddard Stark have done in this moment? What counsel would he give? Would he urge patience? Restraint? Mercy? But Robb had learned something else his father never truly grasped: mercy gets you killed. Promises break you. And the more honor you carry, the heavier your own sword feels. He had broken his vow to Walder Frey. That was no small mistake. He had married for love, not duty, and now the twins were whispering of insult, revenge, and betrayal. Catelyn had warned him. "You are not just a boy in love," she had said. "You are a king. And kings who put their hearts before their crowns end up buried beneath both." Still, Robb hadn't listened. He had tried to hold on to both worlds, love and war, honor and victory. But with each passing day, that balancing act wobbled. Now, he was surrounded by bannermen whose loyalty felt thinner than the ice creeping into the tents. The Lannisters had taken more than a father from him. They had taken the rules and twisted them until even winning felt like losing. And in the south, the game continued. Tyrion Lannister had taken over as Hand of the King in his father's absence, and for a while, chaos began to wear a clever smile. Tyrion wasn't like the others. He didn't crave blood for fun or power for show. He played the game because he had no other choice. In a family of lions, he had survived by being sharper, faster, and more careful than anyone expected. He studied Ned Stark's downfall like a lesson carved in stone. He told the truth, Tyrion once muttered to Bronn. And he died for it. I suppose that's what happens when a man tries to bring honor to a place built on lies. Even so, Tyrion knew the North wouldn't forget. Robb Stark's army wasn't just fighting with steel, they were fighting with memory. Every sword they raised was for the man who refused to kneel. And no matter what the Lannisters did, they couldn't kill that ghost. Sansa remained in the capital, and each day she grew quieter, colder, more controlled. The pain no longer showed on her face. She had learned the same lesson her sister had learned miles away: never let them see you bleed. Joffrey still mocked her, still threatened her, but her tears had dried into something harder. Revenge wasn't something she hoped for anymore, it was something she counted on. Arya, meanwhile, had slipped deeper into the dark. Disguised, dirt-covered, forgotten, she traveled through burned villages and ruined towns. She saw what war looked like from the ground. Not banners and speeches, but hunger, corpses, and screams. She no longer looked like a Stark. She looked like a ghost with a list carved into her memory. She kept adding names. Joffrey. Cersei. Island Pain. The Mountain. The Red Woman. The Tickler. Oliver. The Hound. Names of people who had wronged her, or wronged her family. Names she whispered before sleep, like a lullaby made of knives. But beyond all these scattered Starks and spinning wheels, something larger was beginning to rise. Beyond the narrow sea, a girl with silver hair and dragons in her bones was gaining power. Daenerys Stormborn, last daughter of a fallen house, now carried the flame of old vengeance in her heart. And though she had never met Ned Stark, his death had pushed the world closer to the chaos that would make her rise possible. Because when one man refuses to play the game, others rise to rewrite the rules. Back at the Wall, Jon Snow had finally accepted something: he could not live by his father's values alone. The Night's Watch was not a place for ideals, it was a place for survivors. Wildlings gathered beyond the Wall in numbers not seen for centuries. Something ancient was stirring. And Jon, even as he wore black, felt the ghost of his father behind every step he took. But he knew now that honor wasn't enough. It never had been. Ned Stark had been the last man to believe that truth alone could win a war. The realm was proving him wrong every single day. Walder Frey's hall smelled of old meat, damp fur, and something far worse: false hospitality. Robb Stark stood among the banners of his allies, surrounded by music and wine, but the air felt too still. The smiles were too wide. The laughter too forced. His mother, Catelyn, sat beside him at the high table, her eyes scanning every face like a wolf sensing a trap. And still, despite the unease, the drums kept playing. Despite the cold in her bones, the bride smiled. Despite everything, the doors remained closed. Robb had come to make peace. Or at least, to fix the insult. He had broken his oath to Walder Frey, and now he was here to mend it with marriage, a wedding between his uncle Edmure and one of Frey's many daughters. It was supposed to be a gesture of goodwill. A way to keep the fragile alliance alive. But nothing in Walder Frey's keep felt alive. It felt like the last breath before drowning. Catelyn leaned toward Robb and whispered, "Something is wrong." He didn't answer. He knew it too. But what could they do? They were deep inside the twins. Surrounded by Frey soldiers. Trapped by the very peace they had tried to create. Then the music changed. Not a joyful tune, but something slower, darker, too familiar. Catelyn's fingers clenched her goblet. Her eyes caught the movement, one of the musicians pulling something from his sleeve. A glint of steel. And in that moment, everything unraveled. Screams. Arrows. Blood. The Red Wedding had begun. Robb turned, stunned, as his men were cut down around him. The bride's smile vanished, and her eyes filled with tears as the first bolts tore into the hall. Catelyn grabbed a dagger, screaming warnings that came too late. Grey Wind, Robb's dire wolf, howled from the kennels, trapped, fighting against iron bars until silence took him too. Robb was shot first in the leg, then in the chest. He dropped to his knees, staring not at his killers, but at his mother. She grabbed Walder Frey's wife and held a knife to her throat. "Let him go, and I swear I'll let her live." Walder Frey didn't even blink. "I'll find another wife." Then came the final blow. A Lannister bannerman stepped forward, gold glinting on his chainmail. "The Lannisters send their regards," he said, before plunging a sword into Robb's heart. Catelyn didn't scream. She just stood there, eyes empty, blade trembling in her hand. Then she slit the girl's throat, and the hall took her too. News of the slaughter traveled slower than truth, but when it reached the north, it landed like a blade through the spine. The king in the north was dead. His mother, dead. Half their army wiped out. Betrayed not in battle, but at a feast. Under guest right, under sacred oaths. The Freys broke the laws of gods and men, and the Lannisters, of course, had planned it all. They had played the game. And won. In the south, Tywin Lannister sat in his chambers, quill in hand, writing letters that would shape kingdoms. He hadn't lifted a sword in years, but he had killed more Starks than any general ever could. "You cannot win on the battlefield," he had told Tyrion once. "But you can destroy your enemy with pen and coin, and just enough treachery to finish the job." Tyrion hadn't replied. Not because he agreed, but because deep down, he knew that's how the game worked. His father had done what Ned Stark refused to do. He lied, plotted, betrayed, and lived. In King's Landing, Sansa heard the news while married to Tyrion, now her unexpected and unwilling husband. She didn't cry when they told her. She didn't scream. She just stood at the window, staring at nothing, her hands clenched into fists so tight her nails broke skin. That night, she didn't sleep. Robb had been the last hope. The last wolf standing tall in a world of snakes. And now he was gone. Just like her father. Just like everything else. In the shadows of the city, Arya was closer than anyone knew. She had arrived just in time to hear the aftermath. Just in time to smell the smoke of the twins. She didn't see her brother die, but she saw the remains. And something inside her cracked. The girl named Arya Stark died that day. What remained was something colder. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She added more names to her list, then carved them deeper than ever. One by one. Frey. Lannister. Frey again. And more. Ned Stark had refused to play the game. His son had tried to play with honor. And both were crushed by those who played without it. The Game of Thrones didn't reward the noble. It consumed them. And the realm, now soaked in wolf's blood, howled with the ghosts of the north. Rain hadn't stopped for 2 days. The camp had turned into a muddy graveyard of dreams. Swords rusted quicker. Horses refused to march. And the men had begun to break. Not with rebellion, not with open mutiny. No, worse than that, they broke with silence. With empty stares. With the kind of stillness that came when hope had left their bones. Robb Stark walked through his army like a ghost among the dead. No one bowed anymore. They didn't defy him, they simply stopped seeing him as a king. Each footstep through the wet ground pulled harder, as if the north itself was trying to drag him back to where he came from, as if Winterfell's buried dead whispered, "Enough. Let go." But Robb didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Then came the raven. Black wings, blacker words. A letter marked by a red wax seal, House Fry. It was brief. "We invite His Grace to the twins. A feast. A reconciliation. A future. No threats. No warnings. No venom. Just honey." And it was that exact sweetness that made Robb's blood run cold. "Walder Frye wants us under his roof," Brynden Tully muttered, reading it over Robb's shoulder. "You insulted his pride, and now he wants to toast in your name. Does that sound like forgiveness?" Roose Bolton stood at a distance, arms crossed, silent. Robb looked up. "If I refuse, he declares open war." Brynden didn't flinch. Better a known enemy than a smiling one. But Robb turned to Talisa, who stood nearby, hands folded over her growing belly. Her eyes searched his. "We need him," Robb said softly. "The Riverlands are bleeding. The North is isolated. We need the Freys." Talisa whispered, "You don't need them, you need your sisters." He looked away. The wound still fresh, her words always sharper than swords. That night, he gathered his war council. Roose Bolton sat quiet again, but this time he spoke just once. "I will ride ahead to the twins," he offered. "Prepare the men. Soften Lord Walder's pride before you arrive." Robb hesitated, then nodded. "Do it." He should have known. He should have seen it. But when hope becomes rare, even poison tastes like water. As Bolton's horse vanished into the night, Grey Wind howled once, a long, mournful sound that sent chills through every man awake. Talisa clutched her stomach. The wind changed. The twins stood tall and cold like two bony hands across the river. As Robb, Talisa, and his remaining men rode toward the gates, music echoed from inside. Flutes. Laughter. Drums. Almost festive. Too festive. Lord Walder stood waiting at the entrance, lips curled into a wrinkled smile that never reached his eyes. "King Robb," he greeted, with mock courtesy. "Welcome. We've prepared a special seat for your queen." Robb forced a nod. "Thank you, Lord Walder. I hope tonight brings peace between our houses." "Oh, it will," Frye smirked. "One way or another." Talisa's hand tightened in his. She didn't say a word, but he felt her fear. It poured from her skin like sweat. Inside, the hall was warm. Too warm. Fires blazed on every wall. The air thick with roasted meats and spilled ale. But something was off. The music was offbeat. Too fast. Too loud. And the doors, they closed behind them too quickly. Too quietly. When Lord Frye stood to make his toast, Robb raised his goblet out of duty, not trust. And when the music stopped, it was like the world had gone mute. Then came the first scream. Talisa's. It tore through the hall like a blade. Blood bloomed across her stomach, soaking through silk. Robb turned, stunned, as knives flashed from sleeves, and crossbows were raised from balconies. The Freys smiled as they murdered. Men who had marched with Robb for 3 years fell without raising their swords. His bannermen. His friends. Grey Wind's howl echoed from outside, then stopped. Robb screamed, lunging toward Talisa, but too late. Her eyes had gone still, her hand still gripping his as her blood spilled across the cold stone. He was on his knees when Roose Bolton walked up behind him, armor clean, expression unreadable. "This is the price of pride," Bolton said quietly. Robb turned his head, eyes full of fire. "You." Before he could finish, Bolton stabbed him clean through the heart. The Lannisters send their regards. And just like that, the young wolf fell. Snow had begun to fall in the north. Not heavy, not yet, but enough to send a chill through every man who knew what winter meant. Robb Stark stood at the walls of Winterfell, watching the skies darken, the world preparing itself for something worse than ice. He knew war was inevitable now. The letter from King's Landing made it clear, Joffrey was not interested in diplomacy, compromise, or peace. His rule was law. His command, absolute. And any refusal to bend the knee was an act of war. And Robb had no intention of bending. In Dragonstone, the sea howled against the cliffs as Stannis Baratheon stood in his war room, staring at the map table. His jaw clenched, his eyes bloodshot. Around him, his bannermen waited for orders, their ships ready, soldiers armored. "The boy writes with fire," he said, tossing Joffrey's letter into the brazier. "But fire burns. And so will he." Melisandre stepped forward from the shadows. "You must strike now, before the boy becomes legend. You are the rightful king." But even Stannis could feel it, the tides were not in his favor. His claim was lawful, yes. But Westeros did not care for law, it cared for power. And Joffrey had seized it completely. In King's Landing, the Iron Throne no longer felt like the seat of a kingdom. It felt like the center of an empire in the making. Joffrey met with his generals every morning. The city's defenses had been reinforced. New ballistae were installed on the walls. The harbor was locked down, the royal fleet tripled in size. Gold flowed from the Iron Bank like never before. The people were fed. The markets thrived. And yet, fear lingered like perfume. Loyalty was now currency, and betrayal a death sentence. In the dungeons, traitors were not tortured. They were questioned. Briefly. Then executed. Publicly. He didn't need screams. He needed silence. Marjorie Tyrell, now his betrothed, had learned to walk the line between adoration and caution. In public, she praised his vision. In private, she studied his eyes for cracks. But there were none. No emotion she could play. No softness to exploit. He was not a man who needed affection. He was a king who demanded victory. One evening, she dared to ask him, "What will you do when the others come? When the wolves march? When Stannis brings fire? When the Targaryen girl returns with dragons?" Joffrey didn't blink. "I'll do what kings are meant to do," he said. "I'll destroy them." Her breath caught in her throat. "What if they win?" He turned his gaze to her, calm, unblinking. "Then I'll burn this kingdom down with me. But no one will forget my name." That was what made him truly dangerous. He didn't just want power. He wanted legacy. He wanted history. He wanted to be feared not just now, but forever. Across the narrow sea, Daenerys Targaryen read the letter again and again. She hadn't expected it. She thought Westeros was still weak, divided, broken. But this young king was none of those things. He was not a mad boy crying for his mother. He was something else. A wall. A weapon. And he was waiting for her. She stood beside her dragons, looking west. "When the time comes," she whispered, "I will not send ravens. I will send fire." But she would wait. She wasn't ready. Not yet. Back in King's Landing, Joffrey sat alone in the throne room. No guards. No court. Just him and the chair that had shaped his every thought since childhood. The Iron Throne was colder than he remembered. But it didn't matter. He leaned back, arms resting on the sides, a king without doubt. He had outmaneuvered his enemies. He had silenced his mother. He had bent the lords. He had built something stronger than his father's rule, or his grandfather's fear. He ruled now, not by right alone, but by force, vision, and will. Outside, the city hummed with quiet obedience. The common folk still prayed to the gods, still gossiped in alleys, still feared the dark, but they no longer feared chaos. They feared the king. And far to the north, beyond the wall, something older stirred. Something colder than even Joffrey's ambition. The Night's Watch sent ravens, but they returned unopened. Because the king had already begun preparing for a different war, not against men, but against what lay beyond them.